Hello and welcome to the Micromobility Policy Playbook webinar brought to you by Ride Report. My name is Simbiat Yusuf, Communications Associate with Fourth, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Attendees, please be sure to submit all your questions through the attendee chat. We will get through all of those questions at the end of the presentation today. The button is on the top left corner of your screen where it shows the attendee chat button, and we will get through all those questions at the end of the presentations. A little bit about Fourth. Fourth is a nonprofit trade association advocating for electric, shared, and smart mobility. We work in four focus areas, mainly industry development, demonstration projects, advocacy, and consumer engagement. We are advancing electric, smart, and shared transportation through all. You can find more information about Fourth, our membership program, and our work on our website, link provided. The fourth Roadmap Conference in 2020 will be held in conjunction with EVS 33. Fourth is supporting the EVS, the 33rd International Electric Vehicle Symposium and Exposition as the local host organization. EVS 33 will be held in June 14th through 17th of 2020. You can show your support for Fourth by registering using our code EVS 33 Fourth. Our speakers today are Fourth Senior Director of Public Affairs and Policy, Jeanette Shaw, Seth Shultz, Executive Director of Streets for All Coalition and founder and CEO at Urban Breakthroughs, and Regina Clewlow, CEO and founder of Populus. Jeanette works to develop transportation electrification and e-mobility legislations and regulatory policies. She also oversees marketing and communication strategies for the core team. Jeanette holds an executive MBA from Stanford University and a BS from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Seth Shultz is the founder of Urban Breakthroughs, a consultancy focusing on climate change in cities. He has over 20 years of experience working internationally on the environment, sustainability, and climate change. Over the past year, Seth has focused on creating a space race era mobilization of ride and drive cities and climate change through the creation of Innovate for Cities. He has been doing this with city networks, academia, and the private sector to create a global research and innovation agenda to enable cities to transform at the scale and speed required to combat climate change. Regina Clewlow is the CEO and co-founder of Populus, a data platform for cities to manage the future of mobility. Trusted by leading cities and the world's largest mobility operators, the Populus platform securely ingests real-time data from shared electric scooters, bikes, and cars, helping operators and cities partner to deliver safe, equitable, and efficient streets through better data and analysis. Here's our outline for today. We'll be focusing on what is micromobility and the future of transportation, opportunities and challenges with micromobility, current micromobility programs, micromobility regulations and policies. And we would like to say a quick thank you to our sponsor today, Ride Report. Ride Report empowers cities to bring new, clean forms of transportation to life. They handle data for cities and operators around the world. Before you move on, we will hear a few words from Michael Schwartz, Head of Customers and Policy at Ride Report. And I'm going to hand it over to Michael right now.
Great. Thank you so much, and welcome everybody to the webinar. We are really excited to be working with Fourth and presenting today with this great panel of speakers. We are a local Portland company here with Fourth, and as you heard previously, Ride Report has really developed a set of software tools to help cities get the most out of micromobility and ensure that it's working for them. And so I'm really excited to kind of frame this conversation through our experience working with numerous cities around the world at this point, as well as all the major micromobility operators. So I think on this topic, micromobility has held a lot of promise as being a way to help people reduce their dependency on cars, help connect first and last mile, and there's a lot of promise still in the future. But as a disruptive technology, there were a lot of questions around how to properly regulate these new vehicles. So you're seeing different types of state bills, all kinds of different ways of different cities taking their approaches as well. And so it's been a little bit of a free-for-all, but after about 2 years, some practices have emerged. I'm hesitant to say best practices because I think we're still evaluating, but I think there are definitely some trends and themes that will get touched on throughout the webinar. And so there's 3 sort of main sets of constituents with micromobility: cities, operators, and citizens. And each has a slightly different point of view and things that they're hoping to get out of micromobility. So obviously cities have a responsibility to manage the right-of-way, ensure people don't get hurt and that this is a safe technology. The operators themselves are really trying to sort of make their mark on the world, make sure they have a sustainable business, and ensure that they have an environment where they can operate. And citizens are sort of fairly well polarized on this. Either they're totally excited, they don't care about all the different actors, they just want a scooter, or alternatively, they just want the scooters to go away as quick as possible. But I think most people on this webinar would agree that we all want micromobility to succeed. We have a shared set of policies and interests that micromobility fit into really nicely. Obviously, congestion, sustainability, enhanced mobility and access, particularly in underserved areas, traditionally underserved areas. So it's really about how do we make it succeed in the best possible way and reduce the negative externalities. And so to that end, there are a bunch of policy ingredients that different cities and different levers that cities can pull. One of the first things that we think of that's very important is making sure you define your goals of success and metrics to measure them. We've seen different types of equity approaches, which I know will get touched on in the webinar. Safety is a really important one as we're evaluating how micromobility functions in a city, as well as different caps, fees, and then data is really at the center of all of that. And so, again, there's different perspectives here. For cities, they really need data to do their job. They want to make sure that they're not locked in to a proprietary format so that if they change their approach to data management, they can do that in the future. Operators are really looking to, hey, yes, we want to share our data, but we don't want to be penalized for being the only ones sharing this data. So they want to be recognized for that. In this sense, there's a need for privacy, which again, I think will be touched on later in the webinar. And so Ride Report has actually prepared, along with its sort of real-time and historic monitoring tools, a way to do data validation and auditing. So we actually have these compliance reports that helps understand if they're getting thorough sets of data that meet the different standards out there so they can do their jobs. And to that end, some of the operators who have really done a good job sharing that data in a way that is helpful to cities have become part of a Ride Report certified program. And so this is a way cities can know, hey, if we operate sharing their data, it will be our job. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to the presenters and thank you all very much for coming and attending this webinar. I hope you find it useful.
Thank you so much, Michael. And attendees, please remember to submit all your questions through the attendee chat. Again, that button is on the top left corner of your screen. We will also be sharing the slides after the presentation, and we will also have the webinar presentation shared with all attendees. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeanette Shaw from Fourth, and she will present on Fourth's perspective on micromobility.
Great, thank you so much, Simbi, for the introduction. I'm honored to be on this panel with micromobility experts Seth and Regina and setting the stage for the conversation, and also want to again thank Michael and Ride Report for sponsoring, and to those of you attending, thank you. And as Symbiont has mentioned, Fourth is an advocate for electric, shared, and smart mobility. And we really do this, she had mentioned, in 4 buckets. And here are the ways that we integrate with consumer engagement. And within this, and I'll get to it a little later, is we have e-scooter safety workshops, but we really work to promote transportation electrification and fuel cell technology. So as we like to say, butts in seats. So have consumers out there really trying the technology, seeing that not only is it easy, it's ubiquitous, but there's, of course, opportunities and challenges, which we'll be covering within this webinar. Within policy advocacy, of course, we work on many different fronts, whether it's promoting electric vehicle rebates or tax incentives to ensuring that there are pilot programs available for e-mobility, also for demonstration projects, and really working to ensure that both urban and rural, low, moderate income communities can also engage in these projects. And then with industry development, of course, working together to ensure that whether it's e-scooters, e-bikes, electric vehicles, tractors, medium and heavy duty folks, we integrate together and build on best practices. And within that too, Fourth is working with Bloomberg American Climate Cities Challenge to really help support both deep carbonization, but also through transportation electrification, which of course includes our electric mobility, which we're here to speak about today. And as also somebody had mentioned, Fourth has the largest electric symposium in the United States, which will be held in conjunction with the Worldwide Electric Vehicle Symposium in June in Portland, Oregon, 2020. So very excited. We're going to have all sorts of e-mobility from the medium and heavy duty to the light duty space. So really look forward to showcasing what all of us have done, both in the United States, but also Europe and internationally. So very excited for that opportunity to highlight micromobility. And oftentimes those of us who are in the industry tend to throw out the term micromobility, and oftentimes we get some blank stares from consumers and even some legislators or even staffers. And really for us, it's a category, it's a mode of transport. It refers to electric scooters, electric bikes, could be skateboards, shared bicycles that go really shorter distances around cities and often to or from another mode of transportation, whether it's a bus, a train, a car. So it's really meant to help solve some of the first and last mile transportation issues that we have and to help reduce congestion within the cities. And usually, typically it's individuals who are renting a scooter or renting a bike for a very short amount of time, typically using an app. So that's what we tend to refer to as micromobility. And within cities, and I've highlighted here, of course, many cities across the United States are implementing pilot scooter programs or just scooter programs in general. And here I've highlighted Portland, Oregon. It's where we happen to be headquartered and been working quite closely with the city. They are on their second pilot within micromobility. And what we have found is cities, they could be struggling. There's a lot of action around mobility in urban communities. And cities are really excited about the potential because it's smart city technology, it's advanced mobility, but there's a struggle to really engage effectively, how to integrate it effectively. And particularly because there really has been a 10 to 20-year land use and transportation plan system that really doesn't work well in a fast-moving and disruptive environment, such as where the micromobility transportation space is. And so it's oftentimes we're found that we're having to explain the technology while working in a very fast-paced environment and explaining that not only does it help from, as Michael mentioned, from the sustainability and carbon reduction, but it also will help reduce vehicle miles traveled in most cities, which is something that a lot of cities aspire to. And within Portland, the e-scooters, they did a first pilot, and you can go online to find out what the scooter findings report held in 2018. But short of that, I could just give you kind of a brief overview, and it's a majority of Portlanders viewed the e-scooters positively. They actually used it primarily for the first and last mile transportation, and we're quite happy since oftentimes it was a little longer to walk. It also, the e-scooters attracted a new population to active transit mobility. And that was something that was a bit of a surprise in 2018. I think they just assumed people who were riding e-bikes or shared bikes would be the only ones potentially utilizing scooters, and they found it's fun, and a whole host of others hopped on, and that e-scooters really did replace some of the driving ride-hailing trips that were happening within the city core. And so what we have also found, of course, within not only the pilot project that was happening here in the city of Portland with the first one, and now we have a second pilot project. It's scheduled to end of April 2020, but we're hopeful that will be extended past our June electric vehicle symposium in Portland. So our visitors, anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 of them, could utilize the e-scooters and e-bikes and transit mobility. But within opportunities and challenges, we have a few that's highlighted here. And I've had an opportunity, really, the docked bikes paved the way. And I think that when I say paved the way, it introduced this topic and this disruptive mobility and gave it an opportunity for e-scooters then to come along and perhaps benefit from some of the disruptive nature that had occurred before. But what we have found is that within the opportunities and challenges, it, as I mentioned earlier, it does reduce vehicle miles traveled. There can be equitable and sustainable transit option opportunities, but then also on the flip side with challenges, we have found that riding can be an issue. That includes a safety parking. Now, are they strewn across sidewalks? Are they parked into the middle of a roadway? Equitable access has been a concern to most communities that we work through with across the United States, because not all communities have the same level of access or even to smart technologies such as apps, and that transportation options we've seen across the United States that they tend to be penalized because there's it's usually transit versus micromobility, transit versus shared mobility, and actually it should all work within an ecosystem. And I know Regina is going to be touching on this, as well as the next topic with data privacy and security. Those are topics that are very concerning to most individuals, as well as the data companies, the micromobility companies. And then there's the issue again of whether how you service these, and if you're servicing with vehicles that are gas combustion as opposed to electric, so you're adding that many more vehicle miles traveled on the roadway. But what we've also found is that equity is a huge concern, and that's one of the areas that Fourth within our pilot and demonstration projects has spent quite a bit of time working on. And we've done this both through car sharing projects as well as working with transportation network companies. And through different pilot projects, we have learned several strategies. And really that is listed here, but within the communities, I mean, they're really, some communities are 3 to 5 years ahead in electric and smart mobilities, and some are not. Some are leading to innovate and develop best practices, and some really are lagging just because of the technology. And when we've been working within communities of color and communities that are low income to moderate income, we have found that, and this seems obvious, but we've done this time and time again in our pilot and demonstration projects, and have determined that really listening first and not assuming what the community needs. Finding out, is e-scooter better? Is it e-bikes? Is it shared bikes? Is it transit with e-scooters very close to a transit, say bus or a light rail? So there's quite a bit of listening and not making sure you don't walk in with assumptions. And then also supporting what those community-based needs and assessments are. You know, what is it the need that is trying to be fulfilled, and making sure that the community is determining that, and not the individuals who are hosting or assisting the demonstration projects. And then also making sure that it is culturally appropriate. Are the appropriate languages being utilized? Do they have smart technology? Do they have the ability to utilize apps? Are there other modes of or methods that they can obtain the ability to use micromobility? That's something we see quite a bit. In particular, we've had a demonstration project here in East Portland, and that certainly was true there, that there's a community that speaks at least 10 to 12 different languages. So is your information in the languages that they certainly can understand? And then I've also listed here a resource in which we further highlight some of the equity strategies. and recognizing that those are really hard. It's hard work. It requires a lot of internal organization, as well as making sure, again, that you've created an environment which the community is assessing the needs. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to Symbiot.
Thank you, Jeanette, for an amazing intro presentation. And with that, we will pass it along to Seth Shultz. And I would like to let the attendees know that we will also be adding the links in this, the links of resources mentioned by the speaker in the email, recap email as well. So don't worry if you're not able to get that link or copy and paste that link. We will share those after the webinar as well.
Fabulous. This is Seth here. Thanks. Delighted to be here with all of you guys today. And a big thanks to Fourth for hosting this, putting it together. Fourth is also one of the founding members of the Streets for All Coalition. So couldn't be more delighted for the continued leadership you guys are showing in this area and all the support. So I mean, two fabulous kind of presentations to kick this off, and I loved some of the comments. Michael was saying, are there really best practices yet? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, this is clearly a space where we're learning by doing, and I'm extremely excited to be here today. I've been spending the last 10 years building intergovernmental organizations and NGOs, particularly around cities and climate change. So I helped set up something called the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, the Global Covenant of Mayors, CDP Cities. Some of the participants on today's call might be familiar with those organizations. But particularly, more recently, I spent a lot of time in the academic community, particularly with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and was a lead author on the 1.5 degree report. And I'll come on to that a little bit in some of the findings, but it is through that kind of those recent experiences that led me to the topic of micromobility, and a fabulous kind of summary of it, but which is why we set up this organization, Streets for All Coalition, about 6 months ago. Symbiot, I'm having a problem moving my slide. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So basically, the coalition, as of 6 months ago, it's a group of organizations like Fourth, in fact, environmental organizations and others, and including shared mobility providers who are trying to come together to figure out that learning by doing kind of nature of what's in front of us and tackle some of the challenges. Next slide, please. So the main thing I think where Streets of All Coalition is kind of slotting in is around the advocacy, education, research, and advocacy side of things, particularly around a number of these issues and items that you just heard Jeanette outline really well as some of the key problems. But particularly, I think the end goal in sight is trying to help create a system of movement of transportation for people. And I would say, so it's been 100 years where we've been spending time, resources, energy, and planning on designing our cities around cars and not people. And it's at this point, this inflection point in history and in development in transportation options that we're trying to kind of wrestle back the streets for the use of people. And there's a number of ways to do that. Micromobility fits into a much broader transportation ecosystem. And the speed with which that is happening and occurring is why some of these issues, as many of you know, have been bubbled up. Next slide, please. And of course, as we're trying to do this and as we're trying to change the history of cities being designed and used primarily for cars instead of people, and as you're introducing people at increasingly significant rates and scaling it up via biking, walking, electrification of micromobility options, et cetera. It also means there's other issues around safety and how are you integrating more foot traffic on the street with more traditional streets and cars, and you've got safety issues, you've got the issues of sustainability as it pertains to electrifying bus fleets and car fleets and what is the right ratio and process with which to connect those. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next slide as well, Symbiot. So in order to kind of tackle this and why we thought it was so necessary to have these continued conversations, it's kind of the lightning rod issue, in terms of diving into one thing, and particularly kind of the viewpoint of the city, and talking about equity, talking about social justice, talking about data, talking about safety, talking about mobility, and being able to capitalize on an issue that's got so much attention, has so much opportunity and need to galvanize a broader range of stakeholders and conversations around the discussion is really critical. Next slide. So as a result of that, we organized our approach and what we're doing around these key principles. And you've heard a lot about them today. We're going to hear more quite a lot more in terms of equity and data, so I won't get into those too much. But particularly around safety and policy are areas that I'll touch on a little bit more. But these are the broader kind of principles where we're organizing activity and engagement from the diversity of stakeholders in the coalition. And you can learn more about this on the website later if you're interested. Go to the next slide, please. So, and you can continue to the next slide, Symbiont. So particularly, I wanted to circle back and touch on some of the issues that points to and the nature of the kind of challenges we are currently facing. So, as hopefully many of you are aware, understand now, change is accelerating at a rate that was really not understood or even well predicted, even close to 10 years ago. So basically, it was warming 0.2 Celsius degrees per decade. And at that point, we'll hit this 1.5 degree threshold or target sometime between 2030 and 2052. But most of the models indicate that we'll be at that time frame around 2040, 2045, based on continued kind of emissions trajectories and development around the world. Just to put that in perspective, if that time frame occurs and we don't bend the curve and deeply decarbonize our infrastructure and our society, we have some significant things that are on the table in terms of impact: species loss, acidification of oceans, crop yields, climate migration. It's pretty intense, and it behooves us to try to figure out solutions almost at an unprecedented scale. And one of the things we were challenged with when we wrote the 1.5 degree report that came out last year is not just outlining what the science indicates, but the time frame with which we have to do something about it. And at the release of this report about a year ago, we clearly identified as the group of scientists and literature that there's about 12 years in which we can act to try to hold the global average temperature warming to 1.5 degrees. Basically meaning we have to significantly bend the curve by 2030 and hit carbon neutral by around 2050, mid-century. But in doing that, we identified key pathways with which that needed to happen: energy and ecosystems, urban infrastructure, and industry. That emerged from the science and the literature was these systems of change. And cities came on in a significant way as a mode of operation of integrated systems thinking that would actually enable transitions to happen in this kind of unprecedented timescale. And you won't be surprised that within that, there's these key issues like energy, land use, transportation being one of them, on what needs to happen. And we started looking around for examples of what there was evidence, where there were examples that society, politics, technology, and science could rapidly move at the speed necessary. One of the very few bright spots in looking for those tangible examples was the transportation space, which I found fascinating. And 3 years ago, reading this report, if I left in a room with a bunch of other fellow policy wonks and or scientists, we would have drawn up on a whiteboard micromobility. We need large an influx of technology and capital flows from the private sector in coordination with cities that can be deployed rapidly and scaled up rapidly, have a massive mode shift in terms of transportation patterns. Literally what we might have drawn up on a blank piece of paper 3 years ago. And now 2 years into it, we have the first, I think it was a micromobility company that reached the first evaluation of $1 billion in the gig in its economy. And we are seeing not just from other forms of walking and biking, but also from ride sharing and personal vehicle use. But it is really complicated, and in many cases, it's not working yet. And I find it fascinating to to understand, to look at this problem from this broader level of how we're engaging with cities, technological transformation, the rate at which society understands or wants these things, and the role of government that we have in terms of protecting citizens and society, but also integrating and transforming as rapidly as we can for much bigger problems. Go to the next slide, please. So some of the challenges that I just mentioned here, kind of like this is a bit of I'll give you a bit of a little cheat sheet here for some of the stuff that we worked on. And if those of you are interested more in the science side of things, a group of 18 scientists followed up to the IPCC report and wrote a summary for urban policymakers. And what we did is we distilled this 200-page IPCC report into basically a 20-30-page report on what this means for cities. And here you can see some of the key takeaways. The pathways are complex. The methods to accelerate, not clearly understood, or the pros and cons. Cities struggle to interlinked climate change impacts at a local scale, but also as the technology advancements are continuing to be disruptive. And then, of course, you've got all these three things happening at the time. This is not such a big deal in the U.S., North America, where many of you are based, but particularly in other parts of the world, rapidly urbanizing parts of the global South, sub-Saharan Africa. The rate of urbanization is astounding. I think the statistic is something that 1.2 million people moving from rural areas into urban areas, and cities can't keep up with it and move them around. And second, of course, we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and the rate at which changes in technology, pricing, etc., are occurring are incredibly rapid. In some cases, that's a very good thing. In others, that's a massive challenge to mitigate and manage by cities. And of course, then there's all the ecosystem changes and the climate changing around us as this is all happening. So, of course, this is leading to learning by doing, a new focus needed around knowledge and innovation. Everything that we've done in the past is not necessarily adequate for what we're dealing with in the future. And we need to look at this in totally different contexts, different eyes. And we have to start incentivizing communities of practice in different ways. Next slide, please. So just three of the things that I wanted to touch on briefly, and I think you're going to hear about some of these in more detail, some really great examples and case studies. So I won't go into too much detail here. I wanted to kind of provide this broader framing. Is that three of the fascinating things that are happening where we've got this tug of war, so to speak, and where we're trying to figure out how to do this in the right way: infrastructure, fees, caps. So firstly, just to touch on the infrastructure piece. You might be aware that we've got a crumbling infrastructure here in the U.S. The American Society for Civil Engineers puts out an annual report card based on states. On average, the report card from the ASCE on our existing infrastructure is a D+. So it's basically crumbling and falling apart. At the same time, we're adding more people, more users to that system. And as we're adding that, we're also increasingly needing much greater and much more flexible infrastructure. And it needs to be future-proofed. We need to make this resilient and adapt to a changing climate. So this puts tremendous pressure on the existing infrastructure. And while we're in this kind of point of trying to deal with the infrastructure and get bills passed through Congress and the federal government and new ways of coordinating between state and local agencies, we've got an issue where we're putting something like micromobility on the street, which has a totally different use. And it's fascinating that private companies are rolling this stuff out and providing, opportunities for mobility, but what they're using is a public asset. The sidewalk and the streets are a public asset. They're paid for by tax dollars, but they're being used for profit by private companies. So where's the right wrong in this? And if something happens and somebody hits a pothole and falls off their scooter and gets hurt, whose problem is it? Where's the indemnity lie in this? Is this the city's problem because they didn't fix the pothole? Is it the company's problem because they had the scooter that the person fell off of and got hurt? Or is it the individual users? And right now, this is all swirling around in a mix of different approaches and styles. We are seeing some emerging best practices come to light, but this is a really complex issue, and particularly want to underscore and highlight the issue of infrastructure. And in fees, I won't touch on that too much. Jeanette already mentioned that a bit. I think framed it out nicely, but increasingly the fee structure of how this is paid for and by whom is increasingly complicated. We're seeing the private sector, cities and states, all at different ends of the spectrum on this, trying to lobby for and get to see with a new mode of essence. Last but not least, of course, caps. And we all know and are very familiar with how micromobility burst onto the scene with scooters kind of springing up overnight on sidewalks in cities and sidewalks and streets in cities across the country. But at the same time, the scooter companies haven't done this before, and they're trying to figure out what's the right number of scooters, how many times are they going to get ridden a day. And at the same time, cities have to manage and make sure that the streets in their cities are usable for everybody. And what's the right cap? And introduce caps on scooters and shares between the number of companies. One of the earlier speakers mentioned that we want to maintain flexibility here, not get locked into a proprietary system or process. But of course, by doing that, when you have 3 or 4 companies, all with different limits on it, it impedes on their ability to maximize their algorithms or their profits and or their learning rate. And we need to find a way to harmonize to do this. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to hand it over back to the organizers presenters, but look forward to hearing some more examples and enjoying hopefully a lively Q&A with all of you in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth. And we will now hear from Regina Clewlow at Populus.
Okay, it's great to be here, and thank you so much to the Fourth team for organizing this webinar. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on the background because we've been provided with a great overview from some of our other presenters, but I think one thing that we've been really cognizant of is that electric scooters have really dramatically shifted how cities are thinking about private mobility operators, regulations, and data broadly beyond just scooters. But some of the reasons that scooters are pretty easy to regulate is that they're relatively small, they're somewhat easy to confiscate, and thus they've been very easy to impose regulations on. They also grew very quickly. The adoption rates for really rapid growth across the United States and around the world. And the deep dive that I'm going to provide is more specifically around the issues of data. So cities are now asking many of these operators to provide information about how these services are being used. As a former transportation research scientist, much of my work over the last 10 years when I was an academic focused on helping public agencies and really society at large understand how new mobility services fit into our broader ecosystem in order to ensure that we were planning to improve safety of our streets, reduce the climate impacts of transportation services, and expand equitable access. And important to really driving progress towards those goals is the need for data. Cities need data in order to measure progress towards those goals. So for those of you who may not be as deep in the data weeds of data standard, I'll provide a brief overview of some of the ones that are commonly used. What we're seeing in most micromobility regulations is the requirement to share data, including through GBSS, the General Bike Share Fee Specification, which existed before scooters came along, and then also MDS, the Mobility Data Specification, which was designed in a way that would allow cities to access more granular data from those services, and then also for cities to communicate back to operators. So we're involved in a couple of different efforts really to help think about what are some of the best practices for cities and public agencies to access data from mobility operators in a sustainable and secure way. There's a multi-stakeholder effort through SAE that includes public agencies, large transportation academic institutions, and mobility operators and data platforms like Populus, which is developing best practices to help ensure that cities can securely access data while also protecting personal privacy. And one of the earliest takeaways from the conversations in this group is to grossly simplify, there are 3 typical approaches that cities and other public agencies are taking to access private mobility data. One is for that data to be aggregated and self-reported by the mobility operator. This occurs with Uber and Lyft data in many major metros where they're required to provide information, as well as for car sharing. And many of the earliest versions of micromobility reporting in Seattle and DC, the operators themselves aggregated and self-reported data. The second model is that the data can be delivered through a trusted third party. One of the key challenges, I think, around the receiving pre-aggregated data is that cities really want it to be verified as true, and that's the role that Populus plays in over 50 cities around the world, working with data from every major mobility operator. The data is then audited and cleansed and harmonized, which is a heavy lift, through our platform, and then the vast majority of cities find that it's one of the more cost and time-efficient ways to access this type of data. And then the third model is that some cities may prefer to aggregate and access raw data themselves. And then one of the key pros is that it's more flexible. Cities have direct access to the raw data and may wish to experiment with building up their own technical capacity. However, there are different levels of risk associated with each of these approaches. I think one of the key takeaways is that it's really important for public agencies to recognize that certain approaches come with a certain level of risk. So from going from left to right, the consultants that we're working with is also finding that the least risky for the public agency is to push the reporting burden onto the operator, with the most risky being for the city to ingest large amounts of data that can potentially be used to re-identify individuals. So going a little bit deeper into this topic, which is a complex one and is a continuing conversation that is evolving, there have been a number of concerns that have been raised by privacy advocates as well as companies themselves about the type of data that cities have asked for. And there were two key issues. The first is that one of the key elements that many cities are asking for is raw granular data with full GPS traces of routes for trips. And the challenge is that this type of data can somewhat easily be combined with other data sets to re-identify people. So if I'm a user of a shared scooter and I take that device from my home to my work or to a doctor's appointment, it is feasible for a smart data scientist, and there are lots of smart data scientists out there, to then combine that trip data with other sources of data to retrace my routes and activities. And one of the key issues is that we have increasingly more stringent privacy laws that are being passed, GDPR in Europe and the California Consumer Privacy Act, and some questions about whether or not this data is considered personal information, how it should be secured, how it should be used, processed, stored, etc. A second key issue is the nature of what type of data is needed. And so one of the key areas of focus that we are working on with this group at SAE is to really ensure that cities are able to access data that they need to better plan for the future of mobility. We want to make sure that we get mobility data sharing right the first time around, and that cities are able to continue to access the information they need to ensure that our streets are safe, equitable, and increasingly clean. I'm going to dive into a couple of examples of that second model that I described about how cities are accessing data information to materially shape their local mobility policies and transportation plans on the ground through a trusted third party. So a bit of background on Populus. We were founded by transportation and city planning PhDs from UC Berkeley and MIT. We've been around for about 2 years, and in just the last year, we've processed more than 20 million trips in over 50 cities around the world. We harness and contribute to multiple open data standards, including GBFS and MDS, which are really critical to enable cities to access that information. And so these are a couple of the key examples on the policy and planning front that cities are now using to make key decisions about micromobility. In Chicago, for example, there is an existing docked bike share system, and what we've been doing in Chicago is helping access data from a pretty large number of operators. There were 10 that operated as part of the pilot, and cities are beginning to set priority zones to ensure equitable access. Seth kind of mentioned one of the key issues there around fees and costs. At Populus, we really believe that we need to look to multiple sources of financing in order to ensure that transportation services are equitably distributed. All transportation services receive some form of subsidy, and we can't place the burden of providing equitable access, I think, to private operators without also thinking about where those funds come from to support that distribution of services. Second, one of the really promising things that we've seen is that cities are now taking data from micromobility operators and then carving off more space on our streets for these sustainable modes. So in Arlington County, the county is using de-identified GPS data from shared scooters to identify new parking corrals. They've put them up all over the county. And now really the next step is to think about additional protected lane infrastructure. But in the case of parking, they were able to design and communicate these new parking infrastructure opportunities within our platform. And then the operators themselves have integrated those preferred parking areas to guide their users to place those vehicles in those corrals. And then through our platform, the county can monitor how effective are these parking corrals, how frequently are they being used, are there other areas where we can identify new parking options. And then last, and this is, I think, harder change, but we're building some new partnerships with consulting firms that are very involved in creating active transportation infrastructure. But last is to help cities really carve off new space in order to allow for bikes, pedestrians, and yes, shared scooters travel more safely in our cities without fear of death or injury. So with raw GPS data, that sensitive data, we at Populus aggregate volumes of millions of scooter trips to help cities think about where they might be able to place new protected lane infrastructure. Those are the key examples that I wanted to share, and I want to leave time for questions, but I think that some of the key takeaways that I want to share is that first, I hope everyone keeps in mind that one of the key benefits of new micromobility solutions is that all of a sudden there are new modes of transportation and business models that have attracted a much broader segment of people to demand more cycling infrastructure and safer streets. According to a recent NACTO report, when you combine traditional bike share and now the emergence of scooters, the number of trips has doubled in basically just 1 year, which is truly incredible. And there are some larger transportation policies, including the recent NTSB recommendation around helmet laws, that now you have a broader coalition of people pushing back against and saying, hey, we need to really place the responsibility of designing safer streets on our cities, our public agencies, and also to think about these larger vehicles that move around them and not place the entire burden on our most vulnerable road users. So we hope that a lot of the policies in cities keep in mind mode neutrality, that we recognize that subsidies are provided for multiple transportation solutions, including our own personal automobiles, and hope that policies don't penalize transportation options, including transit, micromobility, that can potentially help us make progress on equity, efficiency, and climate goals. So thank you so much for having me as part of this webinar, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Regina. And now we will open it up for questions. Please be sure to submit any questions you have through the attendee chat. We already have some questions, so I am gonna get that going. This is open to all speakers. Are the insurance companies starting to offer policies for micromobility riders? Do we know that?
Yeah, this is Jeanette. I'm not sure from what standpoint, if it's actually for the individual rider, if the question is geared to the individual rider, or if it's for from a health perspective, or if it's from damaging property. But that's something I would need to investigate further. So perhaps we could take that one offline. I'd be happy to answer that one.
Thank you.
This is Regina. I can chime in. Sorry, I think there are a number of insurance companies that are experimenting with personal mobility policies. So they're recognizing that we're seeing more and more people who live in cities that are multimodal who may not own a car and therefore do not purchase car insurance. And so they're offering bundles that cover you when you're using bike share, car rentals, car share, ride hailing, and public transportation. And so that is something that we're seeing, for instance, State Farm experiment with.
Yeah, this is Seth. Just to support what Regina just said, there is some interest. I was talking to people from Swiss Re and Zurich, and they are looking at some really interesting ways, and it's exactly as Regina said, it's following the user. So as particularly as cities are trying to come up with seamless ways of engaging in different multi-modes of transportation with a one-pass system that avoids leakages in terms of cost and revenue, that insurance would also follow through the various modes. So it's a really interesting space right now, but I haven't seen anything that's really definitive yet. The other thing that I would add to it that's a little tricky, again, in terms of the complication we've been talking about, is that oftentimes right now, insurance or kind of causality of the rider, the indemnification is being put on the companies that are putting products and options out on the street. They're accepting that when they probably shouldn't because they want to get market share in a city. But as a result, it's setting a bad precedent in terms of what levels of risk they're accepting. It's going to be a bigger problem down the road in terms of trying to sort this out.
Thank you all. The next questions also, I will pose that to all of the speakers today. Are there any efforts to standardize regulations from the city's perspective?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in again on this. So I wouldn't necessarily say standardization at the city level. It's hard for cities outside of across state borders to do that. Internally to states, yes, I think some share best practices and coordinate so they can kind of rapidly learn from each other. It's more happening at the state level where they're trying to have a uniform approach to policies at the city level, and you're seeing some of that back and forth. But I think what's happening more in the case like of data, different cities and some of the larger ones put a lot of time and effort into coming up with a new process and standardization with which the industry needs to adopt, like the city of LA and data as an example. And because of how big the city is, the level of resources they have, and what a big market it represents to the companies, it then ends up kind of inadvertently creating standards and other cities adopt it. So you're seeing some of that happen.
Thank you, Seth.
This is Regina chiming in on the regulatory front. There are a lot of great conversations that are happening through NACDO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. So while there isn't, I would say, formal standardization of the regulations, there is a lot of sharing of best practices through those forums. But one of the interesting things we've seen at Populus is that the regulations are very quickly changing over time. And also the timeline for these processes in some cities takes a little bit longer than in others. And so we might see regulations that were similar to what another city did 9 months ago, pop up again in a city because they copied the language from a permit from 9 months ago and then got it passed 9 months later. So it's challenging. Another initiative that we're involved in at Populus is through Urbanism Next. Up in Portland, or in the Oregon region, through Oregon, we are building a resource, so an online web resource where cities and public agencies can access the latest and greatest in terms of policy and regulation.
Thank you. Next question. Where do we see, or where can we see micromobility going in the next 5 to 10 years? What's the vision for micromobility?
You want the next 5 to 10 years, the vision? Break out that crystal ball. I mean, I think from the city's perspectives, it's one way you can grapple with the amount of urban traffic that we're seeing, and to Seth's point earlier, how do you reduce the overall carbon urbanization of transportation electrification? So I could see in 5 to 10 years, and even going to the insurance question, that ends up being really an individual personal mobility. where it's not car dependent, and we're no longer focusing the society around a car, but around individuals and around land use that helps promote livability, sustainability. Seth, Regina?
I mean, I don't think I can give a better answer than what you did. The only thing I would maybe offer is that and I don't want to repeat what we've already been saying, but we are learning at a ferocious pace right now, and a lot of the complexities right now exist because of how siloed the transportation options are and the communities that provide them. And I think in the very near future, in the 5 to 10 year window, you're going to see some of those things begin to merge, and you'll see kind of seamless interoperability between an autonomous electric vehicle versus a flying vehicle, which will be available for the Olympic Games in LA. Just to put that in context, right? That's in 10 years. That will happen then. And you'll have options. People will have a plugged-in electric scooter in the trunk of their autonomous vehicle. It'll all just be interconnected, and some of this won't be an issue. I personally believe. I think a big part of it is actually, again, going back to the urban footprint. How are our streets designed? And I think that is where there's even some more intractable issues and some time frames about how moving that from a very inflexible, rigid lock and plot structure is going to be needing to change over the next 10 to 20 years.
Regina, do you have an answer to the future question?
I like to think that electric scooters are really just a gateway drug to more e-bikes. So I think we'll see what happens.
Thank you all today. And if we did not get to your question today, please feel free. The contact information for our speakers today are provided here, and we will also provide that in the recap email. If you have questions specific to each of the speakers, you can ask them directly via email, and we would like to continue this conversation as micromobility is getting bigger and bigger in our cities. So with that, I would like to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our sponsor, Ride Report, and to our speakers for an amazing presentation. Thank you, Jeanette, Regina, and Seth. And like I've mentioned, please feel free to email them, and we will send out the webinar presentation and slides shortly. Lastly, our last webinar of the year, if you would join us for a review of 2019 and looking forward to 2020, we will be joined by our Executive Director, Jeff Allen, and guest speaker, Philippe, Secretary General of AVER in France, to discuss some highlights from the industry nationally and internationally, as well as provide a sneak preview of what we will expect in 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will share all of the slides, and please feel free to keep the conversation going via email. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in December.
Thank you. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.